Hey everybody, Green Films Official here, and welcome to the first ever episode of Spectacularly Strange Cinema, the series in which I review, analyze, and dissect weird movies and take a deep dive into why I love them. Let me begin by introducing a very interesting man, Andrzej Żuławski. Andrzej Żuławski was a Polish filmmaker whose films often went against mainstream norms and appealed mostly to fans of European art house cinema. Personally, I think he was a genius, but his films can be pretty extreme, and it's no surprise that he was a controversial figure in his time. A fair few of his films were outright banned once they were finished, and didn't get released until years after the fact. In one very tragic instance, he wasn't even allowed to finish the film he was currently working on. While his sci-fi epic On the Silver Globe was 80% through production, Polish authorities shut down the project on charges of extremely low labor efficiency and overprices and, oh god, my filmmaker soul, they destroyed any and all sets, costumes, and props. But even despite this, On the Silver Globe was still released. 8 years later, Żuławski filled in the missing scenes with footage of the streets of Poland with narration of him explaining what would have happened in these missing scenes, and signing off with a direct message to the audience in which he states that the drama of the film's production and the larger drama of the lives of both himself and everyone else who worked on the film will continue to interweave into a web of triumphs and failures.
Nazywam się Andrzej Żuławski. Jestem reżyserem filmu na Srebrnym Globie.
Shit goes hard, man. I highly recommend On the Silver Globe. Not only is it a delightfully weird little sci-fi experience and a technical marvel of filmmaking, but it's also a phenomenal example of one of Andrzej Żuławski's greatest strengths as a filmmaker, his ability to take negative experiences in his life or those close to him and use those experiences as fuel for impactful and thought-provoking art. Enter his directorial debut, The Third Part of the Night, a surrealist war drama psychological horror film he co-wrote with his father, Miroslav, based on the latter's experiences during the Nazi occupation of Poland. As you would probably expect, the Nazi occupation of Poland left a massive impact on Polish society, and this was reflected in the Polish film industry. Many Polish filmmakers made films about it, almost to the point that Polish World War II film could be considered its own genre. Naturally, these films sought to capture the awfulness and hell that was the time period, The Third Part of the Night being one of these films. But this is spectacularly strange cinema, so let's just say its approach is a little different. The film was released on the 4th of January 1972 and stars, and I sincerely apologize for these pronunciations, Leszek Telezinski and Małgorzata Bronek. God, I hope I got those pronunciations right. Please don't crucify me. The plot revolves around a man named Mikhail who is left traumatized and scarred after he witnesses his family get brutally murdered by German soldiers. He joins the Polish resistance to fight back against the country's oppressors, but things get weird when he encounters a woman who looks exactly like his late wife. And, well, after even more weird and disturbing shit, his mental state takes a very severe decline. The film only gets darker and more surreal the longer it goes on, and quite frankly, the overall experience is one of the most bewildering things I've ever seen. Throughout the runtime, Mikhail encounters doppelgangers and visions of ghosts from the past. A key focus of the film's plot is Mikhail getting a job in which he feeds his own blood to lice to help develop a vaccine for typhus. We get several close-ups of the lice, and it's really gross and weird. The soundtrack is unashamedly electronic, even though it doesn't fit the time period, only making the film's atmosphere all the more odd. The four horsemen of the apocalypse are literal characters in the story. All the while, Poland's inhabitants slowly go more and more insane, including major characters. Several of them go on these long, unhinged rants, usually about something nefarious or philosophically dark as they stare deeply into space. I mean, one of them's blind, but still. The point still stands that by the time the movie ends, a point where a lot of these people were sane is now just a burning memory. Watching this film feels like being placed into a confusing nightmare realm that leaves you horrified and bewildered at every turn, trying and failing to make sense of this depraved absurdity and maybe, just maybe, that's the point. Andrzej Żuławski was only around 5 years old by the time World War II ended, meaning he likely didn't have any strong memories of it. But his father, Miroslav, certainly did. Miroslav had a first-hand look into the real-life horrors of Nazi-occupied Poland. Most notably, he witnessed his daughter get murdered, and at one point, he fed his own blood to lice to help develop a vaccine for typhus. Yeah, that bit in the movie about feeding lice, that happened, like, for real. And Andrzej Żuławski's father experienced it firsthand. You know, reality is just as strange as fiction sometimes, isn't it? Years and years later, Andrzej and Miroslav wrote the third part of the night together, basing the story on Miroslav's experiences. And as a result, many of the film's most horrific moments are that horrific because they pretty much happened for real. Although they're not on screen very often, the Gestapo are a pretty constant presence in the film, which further contributes to its dark atmosphere. Several people, including children, are just beaten and gunned down in the streets. On screen. There's a scene that starts off as Mikhail on his way to his first resistance meeting until... Holy shit! Mikhail's go-between just gets violently killed, and now the Gestapo are running after him. What starts off as a relatively normal scene just out of nowhere turns into a moment of extreme horror as Mikhail is relentlessly chased through the city streets. Which, I guess, basically could have happened to any Polish citizen at the time. But I've made it abundantly clear that Andrzej and Miroslav didn't just write about Miroslav's experiences and call it a day. No, they threw more than a dash of surrealist horror into the mix. But why? Doesn't it just result in the film not making any goddamn sense? Poland was an absolute hellscape when it was occupied by the Nazis. It was a time of oppression, death, and real-life horror. Many, many people died, and those who didn't were left physically and mentally scarred. The third part of the night doesn't seek to just depict these things, but make you feel them. And perhaps the best way of doing so is through vivid and intense surrealism. The thing about surrealist art is that even though it inherently doesn't make much sense, it can still make you feel powerful things. Like, a great piece of surrealist art is basically a dream you experience while you're still awake. Or, in the case of this movie, a nightmare. Carsten Rundquist put it best in his David Lynch ranking when he said,
"A nightmare doesn't make sense, but it can still horrify you. It's not like you try and solve a nightmare, you just feel the fear."
The third part of the night knows this, and uses its bizarre nightmare imagery to really make you feel the madness, grief, and confusion of the time period. Sure, the film uses plenty of actual reality to establish that it's about Nazi-occupied Poland, but to me, it's the bizarre sequence of events surrounding those elements of reality that make this film feel like Nazi-occupied Poland. The result is a surrealist horror masterwork. It's an incredibly effective and evocative piece of art, and something that deserves to be seen by more people. In a way, it's the most important film Andrzej Żuławski ever directed. Just let me explain. Nearly a decade after the third part of the night, Andrzej Żuławski went through a painful divorce, and this divorce inspired him to create another surrealist horror film, Possession. Possession would go on to become Żuławski's most famous film, and although most of its fame probably has to do with Sam Neill being in it, it's also just an achievement of horror cinema. It has just jaw-dropping performances, great cinematography, genuinely horrific moments that burn themselves into your mind, and an incredibly intimate screenplay. Personally, I think Possession is Żuławski's greatest work. However, even so, I think it's worth noting that Possession couldn't have been as good as it is without the third part of the night. Possession takes many of the elements that made the third part of the night work so well, such as its bizarre storytelling and deranged characters, and utilizes them to convey a much more personal and domestic kind of horror, capturing the confusing and kind of nightmarish feeling of falling out of love, to look at someone you've been married to for years and realize you don't really know them anymore. And personally, I find it endlessly fascinating that the exact same techniques can be used to convey entirely different concepts and emotions, just given the context. On a somewhat unrelated note, I think it's really cool that there are two different surrealist horror films from the same director that use very similar storytelling techniques, but are about very, very different things. Even if it isn't intentional, it's sort of a neat way of showcasing that no matter who you are and what your background is or what time period you live in, we all experience things that are confronting and difficult, things that are beyond our understanding and that scare us. And look, I'm fully aware that that isn't necessarily the happiest note to end this video on, but at the end of the day, I think that's something very human. And besides, what is beauty without horror, and horror without beauty? What are our positive emotions worth if there isn't also grief and anguish? And it's questions like that and movies like this as to why horror is my favorite genre. Matt Fury, creator of Pepe the Frog, once said, "If you want to escape hell, you can't just ignore it. You almost have to go to the center of it." And you know what? I kind of agree. Anyhow, that'll do for the first episode of Spectacularly Strange Cinema, and oh man, it feels good to finally have this out. I'm super sorry for all the delays, but I hope the wait was worth it. If you enjoyed the video, please leave a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Your support really helps out. I also have a Letterboxd and an Instagram you can check out. Link for both of those is in the description below. And yeah, that's about all I want to say. So I'll hopefully catch you in the next one. Bye!